Today we'll close the unit by looking at Congressional Reconstruction, which was dominated by radical Republicans in Congress. You'll see new rights given to African Americans, but by the end of Reconstruction in 1877, many of these rights would be taken away. Radical Republicans included people like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. They were Republicans in Congress who opposed slavery during the war and believed that the government should focus on civil rights for former slaves after the war. They were not as concerned with bringing the South back into the Union. They did not agree with the moderate policies of Presidents Lincoln and Johnson, and following the assassination of Lincoln in April 1865, radical Republicans would take control of Reconstruction. These radical Republicans believed that the lenient policies of Lincoln and Johnson allowed for many former Confederate officials to be parts of new state governments in the South. They also believed that these policies allowed for the passage of black codes in the South that restricted the rights of former slaves. Radical Republicans passed their own bill, the Wade-Davis Bill, in 1864, and again, this is during the war. They argued that Reconstruction should be Congress's responsibility, and that a majority of Southerners should swear an oath to uphold the Constitution before being allowed to rejoin the United States. Again, that's a stark contrast to Lincoln's 10% plan. And while this bill passed in 1864, President Lincoln vetoed it, believing that it was too harsh. Demonstrating their focus on civil rights for former slaves, radical Republicans passed a series of acts to improve the lives of freedmen in the South. The Freedmen's Bureau was passed at the end of the Civil War and was designed to help African Americans and poor whites in the South by providing food and clothing. The Freedmen's Bureau set up hospitals, schools, and teaching centers throughout the South. Nearly 3,000 schools for former slaves, as well as several colleges, were established. The Bureau attempted to provide land that was taken from Confederates, but the land ended up being returned to its former owners through challenges in court. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 said that African Americans were citizens and outlawed the black codes that had been passed in the South. This was a major step towards equality for African Americans. And the Reconstruction Act of 1867 divided the South into 5 military districts. This put the South under military occupation, with a Union general in control of each district and members of the U.S. Army in 10 southern states. The act also made it more difficult for states to join the Union by saying that they had to ratify the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which made all people equal under the law, and they had to guarantee African American males the right to vote. Andrew Johnson repeatedly clashed with radical Republicans over the issue of civil rights for freedmen, which was something President Johnson was not enthusiastic about. The president had vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau, the Civil Rights Act, and the Reconstruction Act, claiming they were unconstitutional. Republicans in Congress were able to override the veto with a 2/3 majority. The conflict ultimately led to the impeachment of Johnson. Let's make sure we understand that impeachment is when charges are brought against the president. It's like an indictment. When the president's impeached, then it goes before the Senate where there's a trial. And the Senate votes to see if the president will be removed from office. Johnson was the first president to be impeached. Bill Clinton would be the other one in 1998, but was not removed from office when his political enemies missed the 2/3 majority needed by 1 vote. Johnson would serve the rest of his term, and Ulysses S. Grant would be elected president in 1868. 3 major accomplishments of the Reconstruction era that would have lasting impact on the United States were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, or as they are also known, the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. It was not the Emancipation Proclamation, but the 13th Amendment that permanently ended the institution of slavery in the United States. The 14th Amendment said that anyone born in the United States was a citizen, and says that rights cannot be taken away from any American. And the 15th Amendment provided the franchise, or the right to vote, to all male citizens. Sorry, ladies, you'll have to wait another 50 years before women can vote. The 14th Amendment will play a major role in the many victories of the civil rights movement in the 20th century. By 1870, all southern states had re-entered the Union, but there were still U.S. troops in parts of the South. Much of the South was in ruins after the war, and 1 out of every 5 Southern adult males died in the conflict. And with 90% of African Americans voting overwhelmingly Republican, Democrats in the South seemed like an endangered species. Many poor whites and former slaves had a difficult time finding employment in the post-war South. Most former slaves did not own land and had to sign labor contracts with wealthy landowners. Some signed contracts with the same landowners who owned them under slavery. There were two systems in the South. Sharecropping was when farm laborers were provided a place to live in exchange for a large portion of the crops they grew. Oftentimes, these individuals did not raise enough money to pay for the necessary supplies, thus putting the freedmen into debt. Many sharecroppers ended up living lives similar to those they experienced as slaves. Tenant farmers paid rent to the landowners, and like sharecroppers, oftentimes ended up in debt. In the South, African Americans had political power but lacked economic and social power, and many African Americans became dependent on the same people who controlled their lives before the war. The Ku Klux Klan was formed in Tennessee in 1865 by 6 former Confederate soldiers led by Nathan Bedford Forrest, and which spread throughout the South during Reconstruction. The KKK was a white supremacy group that sought to bring white Democrats back into power in the South and reverse the changes to Southern society brought on by radical Republicans. To achieve this end, they used intimidation and threats. Many African Americans and the white citizens who supported them were killed by the Klan. They destroyed property, targeting schools, churches, and homes. The Ku Klux Klan would cease to exist during the 1870s, but would return in the 1920s. Support for Reconstruction began to wane in the 1870s. Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens were dead, and the new batch of senators and congressmen didn't want to deal with what they called the Southern problem. The Panic of 1873 was a major economic downturn, and the many political scandals that defined the Grant presidency caused people to change their focus. As they were known at the time, redeemers were those in the South who wanted to bring Democrats back into power and redeem the ways of the South before the war. And as the 1870s wore on, Democrats started taking over governments in the South. The presidential election of 1876 featured Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden. This was one of the closest and most controversial elections in American history. Tilden won a clear majority of the popular vote, but Hayes won the Electoral College by 1 vote when he won the 3 southern states that still had U.S. troops in them. Samuel Tilden won every other southern state. There was obviously foul play in the election, and Democrats used it to their advantage. They said Hayes could be the president if the North agreed to remove the remaining troops from the South, and if the South received money for the building of a transcontinental railroad that went through the South. Republicans agreed, and Rutherford B. Hayes would be sworn in as president in 1877. Let's close the show by considering the significance of the Compromise of 1877. First and foremost, it's the Compromise of 1877 that ends Reconstruction. The Compromise of 1877 will allow for Democrats to regain power in the South. This will have a major effect on African Americans in the South, as we see the Jim Crow era in the South, which is basically where we have the two races living separate in almost every way, and African Americans will not be able to hold on to the rights that they received during Reconstruction. We'll get into the Gilded Age next time, and until then, good night, Albuquerque.